Hello, students. Welcome back to another segment of Jones Grammar. This is lesson 2 on verb basics. And because there's a lot to know with verbs, we'll actually do this presentation in 2 parts. Here's a little overview of what we're going to be covering in this presentation on verbs. We have 3 big distinctions we need to get down regarding verbs. The first would be that between main verbs and helping verbs. The second, action verbs versus linking verbs. The third, transitive verbs versus intransitive verbs. In addition to these 3 big distinctions, we'll also be looking at direct objects, and we'll be talking about verb phrases. Here are some things that we're not going to cover pertaining to verbs. Verb tenses. In fact, we're going to have an entire lesson devoted exclusively to verb tenses in the future. We're also not going to be talking about some basic or nitty-gritty verb stuff such as active versus passive verbs and subject-verb agreement. That'll all be covered in future lessons as well. Now, one thing that we want to start with here, people, is one of the very most important verbs of all, and that is the be verb. And the be verb is a verb that has 8 different forms. You could call these the conjugations or conjugational forms of the be verb. Am, are, is, was, were, be, being, been. Reason I'm starting with this, people, is because very often students do not recognize these 8 forms as all being part of one and the same thing. When students in foreign countries learn to speak English, this is one of the very first things they learn, and they learn that the be verb is some verb that is inclusive of these 8 other forms. Very often as native speakers of English, however, we don't recognize these things as being part of the same thing. And for purposes of understanding how verbs work and for analyzing lots of things in grammar, we need to get this down and we need to understand these 8 forms as all being one big thing that we call the be verb. So, try to memorize it right now, and the faster you can say it, then the better you have it memorized. Am, are, is, was, were, be, being, been. Just like that. What is a verb? Well, many of you, if I were to ask you this, you would tell me that it has something to do with action, and that is partly true. However, action words are not the only words that are verbs, right? A verb is a word that expresses an action or a state of being. And this last distinction, a state of being, is very important because generally my 11th grade students come into my classes in August very able to recognize action words as verbs. However, there's this entire other class of verbs, state of being verbs, which many of them cannot recognize as verbs. And that's something we need to be able to do. Here are some more basic definitions. All sentences have at least one main verb. If there's no main verb, then it's not a sentence, it is a fragment. Some sentences have helping verbs that accompany the main verb to make a verb phrase. So we'll be talking about helping verbs and verb phrases towards the end of this lesson. In fact, in part 2 of this lesson. Main verbs, in turn, are either action verbs or linking verbs. So we're going to be talking about main verbs first here, and we will start out with action verbs. An action verb tells what someone or something does. That's pretty basic, and once again, I know that most of you guys do recognize action words as verbs. But there is a further distinction that I don't think you've ever considered before. And that is the distinction between transitive and intransitive verbs. All action verbs are either transitive or intransitive. Let's get a definition down here first, and then we will look at some examples. What is a transitive verb? Well, a transitive verb is followed by a noun or a pronoun called the direct object. I repeat, a transitive verb is followed by a noun or pronoun called the direct object. And that is in contrast to an intransitive verb, which is not followed by a noun or a pronoun. Well, let's see our example here. Sally ate her dinner. in this sentence, ate is the verb, and indeed it is transitive because it is followed by the noun dinner, or at least the noun phrase, her dinner. And we can think of this as, now again, we call dinner the direct object here, and the direct object is the noun or the pronoun that is receiving the action of the verb. In this case, her dinner is receiving the action of the word ate. So this is a transitive sentence. Now, this sentence here, Sally ate quickly, is intransitive. Why? It is not followed by a noun or a pronoun. Now, ate is followed by a word, namely quickly. However, quickly is not a noun or a pronoun. We cannot say that it is receiving the action of the verb ate. Rather, quickly here is an adverb, and it is describing how Sally ate. And that's not the same thing as a direct object. That's pretty much all that you need to know about action verbs. So what are you doing? You're taking the knowledge of action words as verbs, which you already have as high school juniors, and you are adding to that knowledge the knowledge of action verbs as being divided into two different types based on whether or not there's a direct object. Now it's time to go on to linking verbs. And linking verbs are a little bit more tricky for us because, once again, linking verbs are the verbs that have to do with states of being that very often students in 11th and 12th grade do not yet recognize as verbs. Here's a definition. A linking verb links the subject of the sentence, in other words, the noun or pronoun that the sentence is about, with a noun or a pronoun that identifies the subject or with an adjective that describes the subject. Now that's a rather long definition, and we'll see a couple of examples. Let's read it one more time. A linking verb links the subject of the sentence with a noun or pronoun that identifies the subject or with an adjective that describes the subject. Now, we looked at the be verb up above, and the reason that we looked at that is because it is the most commonly used linking verb. Its forms, once again, include am, are, is, was, were, be, been, and being. These last three, be, been, and being, when they are used as linking verbs, are always going along with other words, which we call helping verbs. Will be, and then been always goes with either have, has been, had been, have been. And being always goes along with one of the other five be verb forms: am being, are being, is being, was being, were being. Now, we're going to jump out of our PowerPoint slides here, and we're going to go over to a smartboard file. First of all, before we talk about linking verbs, I do want to show you this nice little hierarchy I've created, which might be useful if you want to copy it down, because students very often will, one of the problems that they have is that there are sort of different levels of information that we're discussing when we're looking at verbs. And beyond being able to recognize an action verb, then students will often get confused because there are these other things to look at. For instance, is the action verb transitive or intransitive? And then other things such as helping verbs and linking verbs. In any case, you see at the first level, right, you have main verbs versus helping verbs going on. And helping verbs just sort of stop there. They don't really go any further. And then at the second level, on the left, main verbs divided into action verbs and linking verbs. Linking verbs stop at that level. And then finally, the third level over on the left is where we divide action verbs into transitive verbs and intransitive verbs. So this might be helpful to refer back to every now and then as you're sorting out all of this information that you're acquiring about verbs. In any case, let's go to our linking verb page here, and we're going to make some examples, and I will talk about myself. All right, so we'll make two examples with am, and I will make a sentence about myself, very simple sentence. I am Mr. Jones. Now, if you go back to that definition of linking verbs that we were just looking at, we said that a linking verb links the subject of the sentence, and the subject is what the sentence is about, namely, in this sentence, I. And the linking verb am links the subject to a noun or a pronoun, in this case, Mr. Jones, which further identifies the subject of the sentence. So the thing coming after the linking verb, one of the things it can be doing is identifying, and that's what's happening in this sentence. The linking verb am is linking the subject of the sentence I to Mr. Jones, which is further identifying the subject I. Okay? Now, let's have an example of the other type in the definition. I am hungry. And the reason I am hungry is because I sort of skipped breakfast this morning in the interest of preparing this presentation on verbs. So I'm going to have to make up for that at lunch. In any case, in this sentence, the linking verb is linking the subject I to an adjective, hungry, which is describing. Oops. The subject I. Right? And that's how linking verbs work. Let's come up with just a couple more examples. And instead of using am this time and talking about me, let's say we use were, another be verb form. And we'll make two sentences about the students. The students were, let's say, 11th graders. And we'll make another sentence about these students. The students were excited. What were they excited about? They were excited to learn about verbs, of course. And what we're having here is we're having a linking verb were, linking the subject of the sentence, namely the students, to another noun, namely 11th graders, that once again is identifying the students. And in the second sentence, we have the linking verb were, linking the subject students to an adjective, which is describing those students. And that, folks, is how linking verbs work. Now, if we go back to our PowerPoint presentation, and if we look at the next slide, we see a bunch of examples here. These are all examples of linking verb sentences with the be verb. I am Mr. Jones. You are my student. She is Priscilla's daughter. It was good to see you. We were tired when we got home. I will be happy when this is over. Jane is being silly about this. John has been a manager for 3 months. Now, prior to this presentation, guys, if I had asked you to point out the verbs in these 8 sentences, you might not have been able to tell me. Why? Because you didn't have information about linking verbs, and you might have been very confused if you had to identify the verb. But now you know, and now you can recognize the be verb forms all as a related thing called the be verb, and you can also recognize when they are serving as the main verb, as the linking verb in a sentence. Here's the thing, though. The be verb is not the only verb that functions as linking verbs. We have a few others. Some of the most common are as follows. We have become, as in this sentence. Clark Kent becomes Superman, right? Before Clark Kent is Superman, he has to become Superman. So become is considered not an action verb, but a linking verb. Another one would be feel, as in this sentence, John feels angry. Or seem, as in this sentence, the students seem annoyed. The litmus test here, folks, in determining whether these words are action verbs or linking verbs, is just substitute the verb with a be verb form and see if it makes sense. Right? John feels angry. Well, if we substitute is for feels, John is angry, we would have essentially the same meaning. Same thing with the second one. The students are annoyed. The students seem annoyed. You can see how that verb is functioning similarly in those sentences. So feels and seems and becomes are regarded, at least in these examples, as linking verbs, not as action verbs. Now, in addition to become, feel, and seem, and there are others besides become, feel, and seem. These are perhaps the most common linking verbs other than the be verb. We also have the sense verbs, look, smell, sound, feel, taste, that go with the 5 senses. And these very often are functioning as linking verbs. The challenge here, however, is that with the sense verbs, sometimes they are functioning as action verbs, whereas sometimes they're functioning as linking verbs. Look at these examples. The first 2 examples having to do with smell. Mr. Jones is smelling the flowers. Well, in this sentence, smell is an action, and that is in contrast to the second sentence, the flowers smell good. You see, in the second sentence, the flowers are not smelling anything. Flowers don't have noses. They can't smell. But smell in the second sentence is describing the flower's state of being, right? So smell in the second sentence is a linking verb. Same with the last 2 sentences. Nancy is looking out the windows. Looking in that sentence is an action. So looking is actually the main verb of that sentence, and it's an action verb. Whereas in the second sentence, Nancy is not looking at anything. Rather, we are describing Nancy's state of being by saying that Nancy looks sleepy. And once again, all you need to do is substitute the be verb form in here for the 2 linking verb sentences and see if it works. The first one, the flowers smell good, we could also say the flowers are good, which isn't as specific, but it creates a generally correct sentence. Nancy looks sleepy. Well, that's probably because Nancy is sleepy. So essentially the same thing. All right, guys, we've covered a lot in part 1 of Verb Basics, but because my YouTube time is running out, I've got to cut this short and begin a new presentation, or at least part 2 of this presentation on Verb Basics. So I'll talk to you in a jiffy.